Back in my senior year of high school, I was a part of my school's SCA, which is a student organization where students at the school come up with fun things to happen at the school. I plan to do a field trip to Laurianne Forest campground for spring break. I have never gone camping before, so I thought it would be a perfect thing to do. After getting it all planned out, I gave it to Mr. Thornberry, who was in charge of SEA at the time. He was all down for it. Then we worked on getting the trip promoted, and to my surprise, it was a massive success. A total of 200 students had signed up for the trip. Typically, not a lot of students would even consider something like this. It would get canceled as a result. When it was time to get ready for the trip, I packed my things that I needed, like a flashlight, some camping gear, and a change of clothes. The next school day, everyone who was going on to the trip went to one of the 5 buses that were at the school to take us to the forest. Once we arrived, we got our stuff and went into our assigned cabins. After we had everything unpacked, we had to meet up with the camp counselor so he can explain the rules that we had to follow. It was the usual, don't do this and that, as well as explain the history of the forest back when it was controlled by the Cayuga tribe. Then the camp counselor asked us if we liked scary stories, which everybody excitedly said yes. The counselor then went on to explain the main monsters that the Cayuga tribe believed in, like the Wendigo and the Skinwalker. I had never heard of these monsters before. Back then, I was not really into folklore of any sort, whether it be European or Native American. I just wasn't interested in that stuff. The camp counselor did mention a monster that I did in fact recognize, the werewolf. At that point, I was beginning to lose interest in the whole monster thing, because I believed that those things never existed. But as much as I wanted it to all be over, all the other kids wanted to hear more about the story. I don't remember all the details about the story, except that it is about a member of the Cayuga tribe who disrespected one of the gods that they worship. He was casted out, and he met a shaman, something like that, and turned him into the werewolf that still supposedly roamed the area. When he said that, I kind of started to laugh hard at it, because I knew there was no way a werewolf could possibly exist in our world. I went on to tell the camp counselor that werewolves are only fairy tales that only someone who was ultra religious would believe in. The camp counselor stares at me and told me that he hopes I don't meet one myself. I continued to laugh as we were heading back to our cabins, knowing that it would be so foolish to actually believe all that stuff. Later that night, when we got done with our campfire and s'mores, we went back to our cabins for the night. We were gonna go canoeing the next day, so we had to get a good night's sleep so we can actually do it. Some of the other guys in the cabin had brought their 3DSs or other handhelds. I didn't bring mine because I wanted to enjoy something without any sort of technology around me. I went into my bed. It took a while to actually fall asleep, because the beds, as one might expect, were not very comfortable. 30 minutes later, after I had fully adjusted to the bed, I had heard a very loud, sinister howl. And just like that, everybody in the cabin woke up immediately.
What the heck was that?
Just as I said that, Brandon told me that it was probably from outside. Listening to him say that, I chose to get out of my bed and then walk over to the window. As I was looking out the window, behind a tree, I noticed a 7-foot tall figure that looked like a bulky wolf. But it was standing on 2 legs. Legs that were bent like a wolf's. As I was examining what this thing was, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I quickly turned over to find out where the noise came from, and it turned out to be Andrew accidentally knocking over a lantern. I told him to keep it down, but then when I looked over, that fiend was now facing me. I could feel my heart beat as I was looking into this fiend's eyes. Bright, yellow eyes, revealing razor-sharp teeth, as well as a look of pure anger. When this fiend began to growl, I could begin to feel it on my chest. The first words that came to my mind was, Werewolf. I had never thought it would actually be real, nor would I even see one with my own eyes. Fortunately for me, before the werewolf could do anything, lights began to come on, causing the wolf to turn over to the direction, look back at me for one last time, and then run back into the woods. I slowly went back to my bed, but everyone was asking me what I had saw. I couldn't tell them it was a werewolf, and because they wouldn't believe me, given what I had just said earlier in the day. So I simply said it was a bear. The next day we were on our kayaks in the lake. But earlier in the day, before we got our kayaks, we saw big scratch marks on the trees. And one of the girls who was with us asked, "Where did those claw marks come from?" I got goosebumps because I knew what it really was. While we were all canoeing, I was with Brandon, and we both began to talk about what we were gonna do after we graduated, since it was our final year of high school. Just as I began to talk about what I was gonna do after graduation, we began to smell a really bad odor. I literally felt like gagging from the smell of it, and so did all my other classmates on the trip. When we were going back to land, what we saw almost made me throw up. It was the body of an elk ripped into 1,000 pieces, and it was just a bloody mess. The camp counselor told us to go back to our cabins as they cleaned us up. On our way back to the cabins, I decided to tell them what I really saw last night. None of them were actually skeptic, considering the scratch marks and the bloody elk that we saw. When night came, we all put furniture in front of the door, locked them, and closed the blinds for good measure against the beast. Alfie, who had moved into our cabin just today, didn't even know what was going on and why we were all doing this. To avoid frightening him, we chose to make up the reason why we were doing it. So we told him that we overheard the girls making a plan to sneak into our cabin and try to sleep with us. We all fell asleep quickly that night, and I once again heard that howl. Once again, everybody got up, but Alfie then turned over to me and asked, "Are you sure the girls are trying to prank us?" I told him that it was never true and that a creature that shouldn't exist was believed to be roaming the camp. Before I could finish, there were loud scratches heard outside the cabin. Everybody was frozen as the scratches continued. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the noises change from scratches to a roar followed by geese. We all started to then hear pounding and geese in distress. But the sound that terrified me the most was the sound of flesh being ripped from bone. After all of that happened, we heard one last roar, followed by the geese. At 5 in the morning, we all unbarricaded the cabin, and what we saw was a gigantic bloody mess. Dead baby geese and adult geese alike, and feathers everywhere. "Jesus Christ!" Alfie said. Brandon told us that we needed to get rid of the bodies because we were going to be questioned about this mess, and the dead geese were not going to help. We all threw the bodies into the river. As I got back home, I chose to do research on the forest to find out that it has been in fact a werewolf hotspot multiple times. I am posting this story right now to warn you all that they do in fact exist. Even if you're a skeptic, be careful. Let me give you a little backstory. I'm a 17-year-old male, and I live in Moscow, Russia. In the summer of 2019, I got an invitation from my grandfather, who lives pretty much in the middle of nowhere in the Siberian tundra, to spend a week with him in June. I was not gonna go in the winter in Siberia, as the temperatures can plunge to minus 40 degrees. After my grandfather divorced my grandmother, who now lives in Moscow with the rest of my family, he took it to his head to move to the Siberian wilderness, to the cabin he had owned even before he had met my grandmother. There, he could hunt alone and explore the woods in peace, as he put it. Anyway, it took a 10-hour train ride to the village of Multa, where my delighted grandfather awaited me. Even as a 59-year-old man, he was very healthy and enjoyable. On the ride to the cabin, we conversed as if we had been together forever. I was getting more excited at every moment my grandfather discussed his plans. We would hunt 2 days that week, hike in the deep woods, and fish in the nearby creeks. As we pulled up to the gravel driveway, I sat stunned. No civilization to be seen, and there was just miles and miles of trees. The cabin sat in a grove of neatly lined up trees. It just looked welcoming at the sight. As for the cabin, it was small but cozy looking. It was built with red bricks, and there were about 4 windows lining it. There was a front porch with 2 rocking chairs, and I figured that me and my grandfather would watch the stars these nights. The inside was very nice as well, with 2 cozy rooms, a space kitchen, and a nice living room with a TV. I unpacked and decided to step outside. My grandfather told me to wait a little bit, that he would make a meal of venison and vegetables on the table soon. I stayed up to about 12 o'clock. My grandpa went to bed at about 11, but I chose to watch some TV for a while. After watching a football game, what we call soccer here, I was getting ready to hit the stack when I heard something from the distance, which sounded like a howl. It honestly sounded as if someone was getting torn limb from limb. Grandfather told me we had wolves in the area, and it was actually exciting to hear one. But still, I felt something was wrong, but I just passed it on. The next day, my grandfather took me hunting for bighorn sheep. We traveled along the hills in search of these sheep. Grandfather told me to stay as close to him as possible, for there were wolves and other predators about. What about tigers? I wondered. Grandfather told me there weren't as many Siberian tigers in this area, that there were more to the north. After a long day, Grandfather managed to bring down a buck. Not what we were hoping for, but good enough. We didn't spot any of these bighorn sheep, which was strange, as my grandfather put it. The next days were filled with adventure, as we fished in creeks, and I reeled in a salmon that would last us a good week. We trekked the woods for most of the day, finding a bighorn sheep the day we did not come prepared for hunting. On the second to last night, that was when hell broke loose. At about 1 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of howling. Darn wolves, I muttered to myself as I sat up in bed, but as I listened closely, I realized there was something different about this sort of howling. It was much deeper, like it came directly from the animal's gut. If this animal was a wolf, it had to be a huge one. Wide awake now, I rubbed my eyes and cautiously sat down in my room. I wondered if my grandfather was awake. To my surprise, I passed his room and saw him fast asleep. I tiptoed into his room and took his remaining 700. This animal sounded close, but I thought I would open the door and peek out, see if I could adjust the scope and maybe catch a glimpse of this animal. Perhaps he ran away. As I carefully opened the cabin door, the howl seemed to get louder. It seemed deafening, and I was thinking how the heck grandfather wasn't awake. Stupid me. I should have woke him up. But being my dumb, brave self, I felt I could take this thing myself. As I fully stepped outside and carefully shut the door, I saw it was a full moon. The moon was very bright and it illuminated the world in front of me. I noticed the whole world around me was very quiet. I didn't have this urge to look to my left because I had this strong sensation someone or something was watching me. There, to the left side of me, and merely poking from behind a large birch tree, I saw a face. This face looked like a wolf's, but the problem was, it was about 7 or 8 feet tall. The moon illuminated its eyes, which were glowing yellow. The head of this creature was pure white, and it was impossible not to stare at this thing. I raised the gun, but I didn't need the scope, for I had a clear view of this creature in front of me. Then the fiend stepped out from the tree. It was solid white, and about 7 feet tall. Sure, it looked like a wolf, but wolves don't stand on 2 legs. These legs were very muscular, as were its arms. The fiend had claws that could rip your flesh off easily. Then the creature opened its mouth and howled. The same howl I heard the past nights. It was so deep and guttural. I was so terrified, I just shot at the creature, not knowing if I hit it or not, because I immediately opened the cabin door and shut the back closed. I locked it, and then I heard my grandfather's voice. "What's the matter, grandson?" he said, but obviously in Russian, and in obvious worry, as he saw the gun in my hands and my terrified expression. "There's this fiend out there." I leaned on the door, trying to hear what was happening outside. Suddenly, I heard scratching at the door, and then we heard a loud growling coming from the opposite side of the door. It sounded so low, and for a moment I thought I was trying to talk. I was shaking, almost falling to this floor. My grandfather's face was so pale as he returned with an AR-15. "Why is it here?" I heard him ask to himself. "Why?" I stared at him. "What?" I didn't realize that the scratching and growling had stopped. It was all quiet. After a few seconds, we heard the howl again, and it sounded in the distance. "That fiend has been around for as long as I can remember," my grandfather explained. "It has eaten deer and sheep and left their mutilated bodies near my house and by the tree line of the woods. It never leaves me alone." "Grandpa, we need to get out of here," I said. Me and him stayed awake the whole night, guarding the door. When the first rays of sunlight strained through the curtains, my grandfather told me to pack my things. He drove me to Malta, then stayed with me until the train that would take me to Moscow came. I tried to persuade him to come with, but he insisted that this place was his home and had no intention of leaving it. When I arrived in Moscow, my family was surprised, and as they should have. I was not due to return for another day. I explained that grandfather had some complications at the cabin, and it was for the best that I was sent home. I did tell them I enjoyed the trip, which was true until the last night. As for the closing of his story, I believe the creature to be the Siberian werewolf, a monster has been seen in the Siberian tundra, according to my research. And as for my grandfather, I have talked to him on and off, but every time I pick up the phone, he sounds sadder and weaker every time we talk. I talked to him just a few days ago, and over the phone, he barely spoke above a whisper. He told me everything was fine, that he is just feeling under the weather. I feel like this creature is getting the best of him, and I'm wondering if my dear grandfather will survive another month there. I need to do something, and fast. As I'm writing this, I feel scared. Dear werewolf in the Siberian tundra, leave my poor grandfather alone. He has so much to offer. Back when I was 13, during Thanksgiving, I went up to Astoria, Oregon, to visit family. The rain never stops in Astoria. That cold, wet November morning was just like any other. Emerald fields of grass lay shrouded in low fog with precise drizzle that hardly warranted an umbrella, yet left us soaked after our 10-minute walk. "It's right up here, I swear," my cousin said. "You're gonna believe me once I show you." We emerged from the trail to our clearing. Red ander trees lined the perimeter. The soft ground had been turned at one point by the tractor that sat abandoned on the tiny house. At the far end of the clearing, mounds of fallen leaves squished under my rain boots as we crossed the tree line. "Does someone live here?" I asked. "Already trespassing. As a kid, I followed the rules by default." "That's what I've been telling you. Someone did live here, but they sold it. That tractor right there was brought in to demolish it." He pointed at the rusted cage of metal that failed at resisting time in the elements. "But the work just stopped. Only 3 years ago. Stopped. No one has been here ever since. No one except me and Danny. And now you think." "I don't think anything. I know I've seen it. So has Danny. You're telling me a werewolf lives here? I crossed my arms and stopped halfway across the field. These trees. He laid an arm in a circular fashion, indicating the ring around the mellow. They have some sort of power. I think maybe they help it control when it changes. I laughed out loud. You've been playing way too much D&D. Just follow me. I shrugged and plodded onward toward the tractor. Look here, my cousin said once we reached the broken down mass of metal. Claw marks. I cocked my head to the side, examining the scratches along the left arm of the front loader. Could just be from scraping up against rocks and stuff, I offered. He shook his head. Look at it! He drew his fingers over the marks in an attempt to illustrate the pattern. It's too uniform. And this is all you have? This is supposed to be proof there's a werewolf running around Astoria. No, over here. He walked towards the house. We really shouldn't go into an abandoned house, I said, holding back. We're not going in. You see what you need to see from the front window. I hesitated for a moment, letting my hand fall over the marking again. Giving the tractor a pat, I reluctantly followed my cousin to the front window of the house. The glass was long since broken out, and the roof sagged. The floor inside showed traces of mold where rainwater had made itself a home. So what am I looking at? Look up there, above the fireplace. A wooden plate hung askew, decorated with 5 arrows in a star pattern, tipped to fetch. Looks like something out of the roadside shit shop, I said. It's Ander, same as the trees, and the tips are silver. I gave him a sideways glance. And he noticed because... Danny, his dad's a carpenter. He knows wood. He went in and checked close up and see how the tips are tarnished silver. Uh-huh. So if silver kills werewolves, why would he have it in his house? My cousin grinned and waggled his finger. Yes, I asked myself the same question. Think about it. Guns kill people, but lots of people have them for self-protection. I didn't offer a response, so he continued. Maybe our wolf is up against a rival pact, or maybe the combination of silver and Ander somehow protects him against the moon, or helps him control when he changes. I peeked into the window again, searching for any sign of the place being inhabited. Looks like no one has been here for a long time. Really? A low grumbling caught our attention. Guttural, growling, angry. It's behind the house, my cousin whispered, his pupils becoming black saucers. Run! My heart hammered in my chest as I tore through across the mellow. My cousin, who really could do for some team sports, trailed me, but called out from behind. Head for the creek. We won't be able to cross this from the running water. I ran through the woods, feeling the sting of cold rain on my skin. Leaping over the small stream, I skied to a stop and spun around. My cousin followed, nearly crashing into me. He bent over, hands on knees, huffing, streaming breath. I think we lost it. I punched him in the arm. Asshole! What? We got away? That was Danny, and you know it. You guys are a couple of jerks. My cousin threw his arms up in surrender. I swear it wasn't Danny. He's in California this weekend. Thanksgiving, remember? After he says that, we hear a howl. We need to go now. Me and my cousin proceed to continue running until we got back to the house. Even to this day, I still think of the possibilities that would have happened that night if I had actually seen it. But unlike most, I never saw it with my own eyes. But even then, it still gives me the creeps. And I'm warning anyone watching this, do not go alone. You can use this name if you want to. This isn't my real name. I've never told this story to anyone before. I don't want people to believe that I'm crazy. I'm a professional, and if anyone were to link this story to me, it would affect my practice. But despite that risk, I have to tell someone of this experience. even if only anonymously. It happened back when I was 10 years old in the summer of 1979. Looking back, I had an ideal childhood, which is quite rare now. I'm from the Tirade area of North Carolina, from the area that was relatively rural at the time. I was pretty much a free-range kid, so long as I was home by supper. There weren't any problems. Much of my time was spent playing in the woods and creeks within a mile or so of my house. Naturally, being a bit of a country boy, I was obsessed with hunting, fishing, guns, bows, and arrows. But especially deer hunting. I read hunting magazines ferociously, soaking up everything I could about the habitats of white-tailed deer, from when and where they moved and what they ate, depending on the time of the year. Furthermore, I learned their seasonal diet and how to read their deer sign from rubs, scrapes, spoor, and finding their trails. The experience I wish to relate did not occur in North Carolina, but up in Virginia. It is a memory that haunts me to this day, and it's something that will never go away. As much as I enjoyed the woods and the creeks of my home, my grandmother's place in Blueride Mountains of Virginia was special. That was wilderness compared to the woods at my home. Her in Carroll County was on a ridge about 1.5 hours from home. It was just a 3-room cabin, then without a year-round running water. When the weather was good enough for the unpaved mountain roads to be drivable, we were there most weekends. I would spend most of the day roaming across the mountain from the top of the ridge to the river below. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away on a state-maintained gravel road. But even then, most of the homes in the area were vacation homes and were normally empty. It was a Saturday in June and school was out for the summer. We would go up Friday evening and come back Saturday night. My grandmother was a very devout and probably the sincerest Christian I ever have known. But it was a Saturday morning and I had the entire day to explore the mountain. By this time, I had a fairly decent grasp of the habitats of the local deer population. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk, and when under pressure, such as during hunting season, pressure will come mostly nocturnal unless they're in rut. But this was in June, and hunting season was months away, and the rut was a couple months after that. So I made plans to explore the creek by following it to the river, then follow the river upstream to the big rock, then hike up the rather steep mountain back to the cabin, stopping for a rest at the shallow cave, then make it back to the cabin about noon for something to eat. Then I had to help my grandma in her garden for a few hours. As you can imagine, that was a busy morning and afternoon, but at 10 years old, there was endless energy, and I had decided to take my binoculars and watch a recently timbered patch of land from the top of the ridge once my chores were done. I set off a promise to get back just before it got too dark. The only real agriculture in those mountains was the rising beef cattle, hay, silage, and some other stuff. The apple orchards were mostly in the southern side of the Blue Ridge, near the tourist areas. Most of what the deer ate around my grandfather's cabin at the time of the year would have been tree or terminal browse of any animals, such as pokeweed and other green leafy plants. They would obviously eat any berries that were starting to come in at around the time. There were a few hours of daylight remaining when I took off to the road with my binoculars and canteen spring water. The wind had been blowing favorably all day. For those who don't know, while you may fool a deer's eyes, you will not fool its nose. The wind decides pretty much everything when it comes to hunting deer. On this day, the wind was favorable. It was blowing at a crosswind to me when overlooking the clear little valley. The cleared land went down to the creek and had been timbered the previous winter. It was lush with new growth for the deer to feast on. But it was still low enough that any adult deer would be visible to my vantage point at the top of the ridge. The other side of the creek remained in timber and thick rhododendron thickets. I got settled in a good couple of hours before dark. I wanted to be there in plenty of time for the woods to calm down from my walk, and long before the deer came out. I didn't want to spook any deer on the walk in. As I said, I got settled into my spot and made it as comfortable as I could. Then I constructed a rough blind at my spots. Some leafy branches in the ground would break up my outline. It took 10 minutes to fully get it ready. I stretched out and scanned the clear-cut area below me, double-checking the likely areas I expected the deer to come out of in the woods into the clearing Then I rested, enjoying the pleasant evening, watching birds and small animals. After about an hour and a half, the sun was starting to set, and I took one last drink of water until it got dark. Suddenly, there was a bit of movement down to my right. After scanning the area with my binoculars, I saw it was a deer and a new fawn. The doe paused at the edge of the clearing to make sure it was safe, while occasionally checking her back trail. It then slowly moved out of the clearing quickly, followed by the fawn. It was a large doe with one fawn, which was not a surprise since older does tend to have one fawn while younger ones more often have two fawns. But the two deer were not alone. Another deer followed them. The three deer slowly worked their way to the creek, eating browse. As they do so, the doe would pause to allow her fawn to suckle. It was then I noticed some movement on the opposing hillside. The rhododendron thicket would move. Something large was slowly working its way down the hillside. The rhododendron thicket was especially thick, and while I could not see what was moving through it, its movement caused the thicket itself to move. I assumed it was another deer. By this time it was close to dark. The three deer had taken about 30 minutes to work their way through the little creek from where they had exited the woods. I expected the deer had not crossed the creek and come through the thicket before, which led me to believe that it was an old buck since they're usually more cautious. By this time, it was almost dark. Fortunately, the binoculars I brought gathered much more light. The binoculars magnified and made everything brighter. If I were not using the binoculars, I would have never seen what would happen next. But often since, I wish that I did not have the binoculars that day, or that I had left earlier. But that was not to be. What I saw next has never left me since then. The three deer reached a spot close to the last spot I had seen the movement through, the rhododendron thicket. Just a moment after the deer once again checked their back tail, there was a sudden commotion from the rhododendron thicket. It was a large animal that had suddenly leaped out of the area and taken down the deer in an instant. What appeared to be a large wolf had the doe's throat in its powerful jaws. Astounded, I watched what appeared to be a wolf kill its prey. Besides the fact that there haven't been wolves in Virginia for over 150 years. I noticed that there was something else wrong. The wolf's proportions appeared wrong. Its front legs were too long, its upper torso were too broad to be that of a canine. But then it only became more strange. As the wolf's jaws crushed the windpipe of the doe, I noticed that the front paws were not paws at all. They appeared to be more like hands than paws. Paws which were then holding down the deer in its stiff rattle. As this wolf-like beast dropped the deer from its jaws, it fell to the ground with a loud bang. The night action is what left me confounded to this day. The animal raised from its crouching position and stood on its hind legs to the height of what I could guess about 7 feet. It looked around, including into my direction. It sniffed the air as it did so. Fortunately, the wind had held steady, and I was not able to be detected by a sense. I froze in terror. It did not see me. As the light faded, I could tell the beast was a grayish color. Its fur was thicker around its neck and down its back. Its muzzle was pronounced. Its hind legs were too short in comparison to its front limbs. While it was muscular, it was not overly so. The beast began tearing into the doe with its teeth. It was then I decided to make a silent retreat. I knew it was the most sensible thing to do. All I can say, I was never so glad that I had made a decent blind to conceal my retreat, so that I was able to retreat unseen and relatively quietly. I was fortunate enough that the beast was distracted by its meal. I returned to my grandma's cabin under constant fear of brutal death. I had never been happier to leave my grandma's cabin. It was the last time I ever went there. My grandmother was not one to walk far from the cabin. I attempted to dissuade her from going there as much. Her health began failing her not long afterwards, and her trips became less frequent. As the years passed, we sold the land and cabin after my grandma passed away. It was only a few years ago that I learned what I witnessed that evening was a dogman. The beast had been prior to dusk, and I believe that a person can turn into a wolf. Although it is likely they are their own separate creature. This is my story. I don't know if the dogman I saw or one of its kind still roam those hills, but if you're ever in Carroll County, Virginia, be careful, because you never know who or what is roaming the forests. My name is MJ. I am as of now 20 years old, but my encounter happened 4 years ago when I was 16. I live in a small farm village where everything was miles away. There were about 4 houses on the property of where I lived, and 4 more on the road. I remember that there were 4 kids on the farm, and we'd always hang out. Let me tell you about my encounter. It was a normal day like all the other days. I remember my friend and I, who, for the sake of her privacy, I'll call her Kay. We were hanging out at a big tree, we usually do. It was getting dark and I told her that I wanted to go home, but seeing that she was younger than me and tougher than me, told me we should go into the woods behind my house. My parents always told me that if I wanted to go into the woods behind my house, I should have an adult with me, but being who I was, ignored my parents and agreed with Kay's idea. The 2 of us would go in, see if we could find anything cool or interesting, take a photo and leave. That was our original plan, and soon Kay and I walked our way over to the woods. Kay made a few jokes on our way there, and as soon as we arrived at the tree line, I remember her saying, "Something feels off." I didn't notice at the time, but while we were walking into the woods, the birds and animals stopped making noises. Which was odd since birds always chirped with the occasional yell of a jackal. But as of then, it was dead silent. I felt Kay's hand tremble in mine as she spoke. "On second thought, let's go home," she said as she started walking away. I got confused and annoyed at the same time, and I remember grabbing her hand and pulling her with me, saying, "We came all the way here. I'm not leaving until we find something cool." And boy did I regret those words later. We walked into the woods and I turned my phone's light on since the shadows of the trees were blocking out the remaining sun. I remember feeling really uneasy and heard Kay say, "Come on, let's go home. Something doesn't feel right." Right then, we heard a low growl. Both me and Kay instantly whipped our heads to see where the sound came from. We only saw an impaya male looking at us, as if it was asking, "Did you make that noise?" before turning around and ran off. I gulped. Maybe it was a wild dog or a hyena my dad saw a few weeks ago. I thought to myself, "Okay, Kay, I think it's time to go." I started turning around and I saw Kay with wide eyes. Her face was pale as she stared at something behind me. I felt my heart pound faster and slowly turned around, and what I saw next made me regret why I even agreed to go there. It looked like a buff bodybuilder, although it wasn't. The thing that caught my eye was how its legs were shaped. It was like a dog's, behind legs and sharp claws on its fingers. The thing's face was terrifying. Its jaw was shaped like a dog's or a wolf's. Its fur was dusty brown color. I saw myself looking into its eyes. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. It was a bright yellow, almost glowing type of bright, and they strangely looked human-like. I felt its eyes stare deep into my soul. I was in a trance. I soon whipped my head forward toward where Kay is, or was. She ran off without me. I felt my heart stop for a second as I heard the beast take a step forward. As I turned, it was right in front of me. I felt tears stream down my face as the beast let out a silent snarl. As it lifted its large arm, I wanted to cry out for help, yell out for Kay, but my voice was caught in my throat. The beast growled and I felt its long fingers on my hair. It wore a silent snarl on its face, as its thumb dug through my forehead, with its nails cutting into it. I felt blood run down my face and I thought to myself, "I'm gonna die today." But strangely, the beast let my head go, turning around and walking into the tree line before it turned around, looking at me, as if it was smiling to scare me even more. It turned back around, leaned down on all fours like a dog, and left. As soon as it was out of my sight, I felt my legs start running on their own, and found myself at Kay's house, crying and yelling. I was not even sure if the fiend was following me or not. Eventually, Kay's brother let me in, and I instantly fell into his arms, crying even more. After the whole incident, Kay and I never told anyone what happened to us, or what we saw. But since then, I've never looked at those woods the same way again. I did some research of what I saw that day, and came across people who had some experiences as mine. Some people describing them as werewolves, lycanthropes, or dogmen. Till this day, I shudder at the thought of it. Be careful out there. You never know what might be lurking in the woods.